The sting of salt spray lashes your face as you're hauled toward a longship, the last familiar touch you may ever feel. You're 17, standing on the island's ragged coast, and everything you knew has collapsed in an instant. The men dragging you speak clipped alien sounds, their coarse laughter like a kennel of dogs. Thick ropes bite your wrists raw. Behind you, smoke rolls from the ruins of your village, burning your throat, a funeral for the life that just ended. You're no longer someone's daughter or friend. You're a prize, a piece of spoils. And this is only the opening step on a road that will turn darker than you can yet imagine. This was the Viking Age, stretching from the late 700s through the mid-11th century. We usually picture bold explorers, fierce raiders, and master shipbuilders. We think of sagas, carved prows, and the legendary attack on Lindisfarne. But behind the heroic gloss and the horned helmets they never actually wore lurks a harsher reality. For centuries, the Norse economy leaned heavily on a vast, disciplined, and chilling trade in human beings. Slavery wasn't a side effect of plunder. It was often the target itself, the richest reward a raid could deliver. From the rocky shores of the British Isles to the forests of the Slavic East, thousands of women were seized, stripped of their names, and sold into servitude. This isn't a sensational tale stitched together for drama. It's a history reconstructed from Viking law codes, from the spare but devastating records left by monks from graves and ship burials unearthed in peat and soil, and from the coldly factual notes of Arab envoys who dealt with Norse merchants. If you're drawn to raw, unpolished history, consider subscribing and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's step inside the machinery that made this trade thrive. Because above all, it ran like a system. Popular stories paint raids as storms of chaos. In truth, they were deliberate ventures, more business than brawl. Raiding crews were financed operations. A local chieftain or a syndicate of fellow partners bound by silver and ambition would pool resources to commission or outfit a ship. Timber, forehulls, iron nails and rivets, wool sailcloth, tar to seal seams, and food for the crew. Every element demanded serious capital. Investors expected returns, and the most dependable return was human cargo. Their ships were marvels of design, tuned for this grim commerce. Shallow draft craft, like the Snake Yar or the bigger Sky, could skim over open sea, yet slide far upriver, bypassing guards and striking deep inside unsuspecting lands. Even settlements 100 miles from the coast might wait to see dark silhouettes sliding across the water. Escape is already cut off. That mastery of surprise made slave raiding devastatingly effective. Targets were carefully chosen. What historians call soft monasteries were especially lucrative at Lona in the year 806. Norse warriors slaughtered 68 monks and hauled away captives. Such places offered more than chalices and embroidered robes. They held literate clergy and frightened villagers seeking shelter. The Irish annals of Ulster speak with icy brevity, recording disaster after disaster. One note from 821 describes a raid on Wexford, where raiders carried off a great host of women. That phrase appears again and again. This wasn't occasional cruelty. It was the business model. Once taken, a woman's identity vanished. She ceased to be a daughter, wife, or sister. She became a thrall, the Old Norse word for slave. Even the language shows how deeply dehumanizing this role was. Legal texts often referred to these in the New Agenda, cataloging them alongside oxen or sheep as part of a farm's stock. They were fey, a term meaning both cattle and wealth. Under Norse law, a thr was not a legal person, but an object. She possessed no rights. A master could strike or kill her without penalty. Iceland's Graga's law book declared that Athar's testimony carried no weight. She could not own significant property or contract a lawful marriage. Her children inherited the same chains, ensuring the cycle endured. Free women's lives were shielded by webs of fines and honor codes. A Thur's life was protected by nothing. The descent began the moment she was marched from her home. Captives were roped together, driven for miles to beaches where sleek, long ships waited. There they were herded aboard, packed among stolen goods and armed men for voyages lasting weeks. Picture the scene. Dozens of shivering figures crowded into an open hall barely 70 or 80 feet long, drenched by frigid spray, rationed to scraps of food and water. Sickness spread fast. Terror ignored everyone. Many perished before landfall. For survivors, the nightmare wasn't over. Waiting at the journey's end were the slave markets. Busy, merciless hubs spread across Viking domains. They formed a network binding Ireland, Britain, and far-flung coasts to traders from Scandinavia and beyond. Among them, Dublin, known to the Norse as Dyflin, rose as one of Europe's most notorious clearinghouses. A place where captives from every corner of the islands were bought, sold, and scattered to lives of enforced labor. From Dublin, women might be sold to Norse settlers in Ireland, ferried back to Scandinavia, or shipped off to the new colonies of Iceland and the Faroe Islands. Yet, the web of trade stretched far wider. Important markets thrived at Hedeby, on the modern German-Danish frontier, and at Birka, a bustling emporium on an island in Sweden's Lake Mälaren. These eastern gateways linked the Norse world to the great river routes of today's Russia and Ukraine. Along the famed Volga corridor, captives from Western raids and, in even greater numbers, from Slavic villages to the east. The Sakaliba, described by Arab writers, were funneled south toward the Bantan Empire and the glittering Abbasid Caliphate. The scale of this commerce is almost beyond belief. The 10th century Persian geographer Ibn Rusta, describing the Rus. The Norsemen settled along these rivers, wrote without hesitation. They attacked the Sakaliba, seized them, carry them to Kazan and Bulgar, and sell them there. A girl taken from an English hamlet might first be marched to Dublin, exchanged to another merchant, sent across the Baltic to Birka, and then forced down the Dnieper or Volga on a grueling trek only to be sold yet again in Constantinople or Baghdad for Arab silver, silks, and spices. This is no guesswork. Archaeology has left a mountain of evidence. The girl, dazed with the last strong draft, was escorted aboard by an aged woman known as the Angel of Death, the appointed executioner. She placed the captive beside her dead master, looped a cord around her neck, and handed the ends to two men. As they pulled tight, the old woman thrust a broad blade again and again into the girl's ribs. Her screams were drowned out by warriors pounding their shields, a deliberate effort so other enslaved women would not shrink from death when their own masters passed. Finally, the vessel was set aflame, carrying both lord and sacrificed servant into eternity. Ibn Fadlan's narrative is harrowing, but far from fantasy. Archaeologists have unearthed graves throughout the Viking world that hint at similar retainer deaths. At Flaksand in Norway, a burial held several individuals. One decapitated laid as subordinates beside a high-ranking woman. The renowned Osberg shipgrave yielded to females, one older, clearly of elevated station, the other younger, whose bones reveal a harsher life and lower status. Many experts suspect she was a thur offered up to accompany her mistress beyond the grave. Such finds confirm a sobering truth. For women seized in raids, life might end not only in endless labor or forced intimacy, but as part of a master's property, even in death. A final bloody accessory to display his prestige on the journey to the afterlife. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is how ordinary all this seemed to Norse society. Enslaved people were central to its economy and social order. A chieftain's reputation was measured not just in fields, silver, or warships, but also in the number of thurs under his command. The sagas, the very literature that preserves their legends, treat bondage not as a crime or moral failing, but as a basic fact of existence. Slavery was stitched into the fabric of their culture, feeding the engine of conquest and colonization. Behind every saga, hero, or explorer stood unnamed women whose stories rarely made the parchment. Abducted mothers, concubines, servants, and sometimes sacrifices. Their labor wove the textiles that kept settlements alive. Their bodies bore the next generation. Some even shared their captives' pee. To understand the Viking Age honestly is to confront these silenced lives, the hidden cost of expansion and fame. The grandeur of dragon-proud ships and tales of fearless raiders cannot eclipse the reality that for countless women, the Viking world was a cage, one from which only death or the rare chance of ransom offered release. This was not a culture wrestling with guilt over its own brutality. 'Twas a society resting on exploitation so familiar that few even questioned it. Freedom existed, but only as a steep, narrow path. Man knew mission. The act of releasing a thrall did occur. An owner might reward years of service or leave freedom in a will. The Hong Runestone in Denmark records how Tolki the blacksmith honored his former master, Thorgis, who granted him gold and liberty. Stories like this survive because they were remarkable, not routine. For most captured women, bondage lasted a lifetime and extended to their children. The end of this order came slowly through tangled currents of politics and faith. As Scandinavia adopted Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries, the Church officially discouraged enslaving fellow Christians. Slavery did not vanish. Its targets merely shifted toward pagan Slavs and Baltic peoples. Gradually, the absolute slavery of the Viking Age gave way to the milder but still coercive bonds of medieval serfdom. For centuries, however, the trade flourished unchecked. What the Viking Age lays bare is an uncomfortable truth about how exploitation thrives. The seizure and enslavement of women were not stray crimes committed by rogues on the edge of society. They were an economic engine, a ladder of advancement, a system that society itself endorsed. The silver hoards buried across Scandinavia, the timber halls echoing with feasts, the daring voyages to Iceland, Greenland, even North America, all drew strength from the stolen labor and stolen bodies of women. To understand this period honestly, we must see the whole picture. Admire the master shipwrights, but remember the women who spun and wove the wool that became their sails. Celebrate the warriors' ferocity, but picture the terrified girls forced aboard their longships. Treasure the sagas for their literary genius, yet read between the lines to notice the casual cruelty woven into their plots. The history of what Vikings inflicted on captured women is not a mere shadowy footnote. It is a case study in how a society can normalize the dehumanization of others. It shows how quickly human beings can become merchandise, things to be worked, traded, or discarded when worn out. The proof surrounds us in chronicles written by victims and observers. In Norse laws codifying ownership of thralls in the DNA of living populations, and in skeletal remains scattered beneath the soil. Together, they form a stark ledger of how thoroughly slavery underpinned the Norse world. The popular image of the Viking as a free spirit, wild and unbound, is only half the story. That freedom rested on the backs of the unfree, on the anguish of those seized from villages and shores, shipped across oceans, and stripped of choice. Runstones and sagas may recount triumphs, but the truer legacy is etched into quieter records. The mute testimony of women whose toil fueled commerce, whose suffering financed exploration, whose lives were consumed to elevate others. Their stories, mostly unspoken, are essential to any honest portrait of the Norse past. To look at the Viking Age is to look at innovation and courage. Yes, but also at a machinery of domination that treated human lives as raw material. Beneath the romance of longships lies a forgotten reality. Tens of thousands of Islamic dirham coins have been discovered in Scandinavia, especially on Gotland, the Swedish island that served as a key junction in this network. These hoards of cut and bent silver speak silently of a thriving partnership between Norse traders and the Caliphate, a traffic in which the North's most prized export was not furs or amber, but living people. At these markets, whatever fragments of dignity a woman still clung to were stripped away. She was handled like livestock. The Arab envoy Ahmad ibn Fadlan, meeting Rus merchants on the Volga in the 900s, left a stark eyewitness account. He described them setting up a bazaar beside the river, arranging their captives in rows. A traitor, he wrote, might openly lie with a slave girl while his companion watched. No curtains, no shame. It was a public display of total dominion, a tactic to prove value before the sale. Her body was a commodity to be demonstrated. After purchase, a woman's future hinged entirely on her buyer's needs or whims. The most common fate was endless, punishing drudgery. As a thur, she took on the heaviest household duties, the in-hers work. She would rise long before dawn and collapse long after dark. Her routine was grinding grain with a coup stone until her teeth wore down, fetching buckets of water from icy streams, tending the longhouse hearth, brewing ale, preparing meals, laundering heavy wool garments in frigid rivers. Textile work was crucial, too, producing vadmel, the coarse wool fabric that underpinned the Norse economy. Shearing, washing, carding, spinning, weaving. Each step demanded strength and time, and the entire enterprise rested on the hands of enslaved women. Even Norse poetry captured the toll. The old poem Rig Sula, which mythologized the birth of social classes, portrays thralls with knotted fingers, leathery skin, and aching joints. A poetic but brutally accurate image of lives spent in relentless labor. Science adds its own evidence. Studies of Viking-era skeletons show that those buried with few possessions, likely slaves, often had meager diets and bones marred by heavy strain and malnutrition, a silent record of deprivation. But toil was not the end of their ordeal. For many, exploitation reached deeper. They were also pressed into sexual servitude. This part of Viking society is often softened or overlooked. Yet the historical and archaeological sources leave no doubt. With no legal standing, a female Thor's body belonged wholly to her owner. He could use her whenever and however he wished. The law called it a right, not an offense. Later, Icelandic sagas, though written centuries on, echo that custom plainly. Powerful men are shown taking enslaved women as concubines. For in Old Norse, these were not secret liaison. They were recognized if unofficial arrangements within the household. One of the great family epics, Laxa Saga, tells of an Irish princess named Mel Corker, captured in a raid and legend claims silenced by having her tongue cut out. She was bought in Norway by the chieftain Hersra Dalla Colson and brought to Iceland as his concubine, though royal by birth and mother to his favored son Olaf the Peacock. Her station remained that of a slave. Children from such unions, called friljaborn, occupied an uneasy middle ground. Their rights were weaker than those of heirs born to a free wife. A father might free and acknowledge them, or deny them and condemn his own blood to bondage. This created fraught undercurrents inside the longhouse, where a lawful wife had to share her home with the enslaved women her husband kept as concubines. And for the captives themselves, that tension offered little shield. In the eyes of Norse custom, they were property first and always. This system of sexual domination was so entrenched and so vital to Viking expansion that it has etched itself into the genetic fabric of the North Atlantic. Modern DNA research in Iceland, one of the most carefully documented Viking colonies, exposes a stark truth. Studies of today's Icelandic people reveal that around 4/5 of the Y chromosomes belong to Norse male settlers. Yet more than 60% of their maternal lineages, the mitochondrial DNA passed only from mothers, trace back to Gaelic lands, mainly Ireland and Scotland. The numbers leave little room for doubt. Iceland's founders were primarily Scandinavian men who transported Celtic women across the sea. Considering the relentless Viking plundering of the British Isles at the time, it's almost impossible to believe most of these women journeyed willingly. They became the mothers of a new nation, but they arrived in fetishes. Their genetic imprint, still carried by Icelanders today, stands as unspoken evidence of a mass migration driven by seizure and sexual servitude. For a handful of captives, the outcome looked different. If a woman's rank was clear princess, noble, or the spouse or daughter of a king, she could be worth more as a bargaining chip than as a servant or concubine. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other records describe Viking leaders detaining high-status women or church officials to wring vast payments of silver, gold, or territory from desperate relatives. These hostages lived under constant dread, pawns in the dangerous diplomacy of the age, held by the very raiders who had burned their homes and cut down their kin. Yet ransom was not the darkest road open to a captured woman. One fate almost beyond comprehension reveals how religion, dominance, and violence could intertwine in Norse custom ritual sacrifice. Both archaeology and written sources attest that human offerings occurred and that enslaved women were sometimes selected as victims. The most detailed and chilling description, again, comes from the Arab envoy Ahmad ibn Fadlan. In 922, while traveling along the Vular River, he witnessed the funeral of a powerful Rus chieftain. Part of the ceremony demanded that one of the man's enslaved women volunteer to die with him, destined to serve her master in the next world. But this volunteering was a fiction, as a thur she had no power to refuse. Ibn Fadlan recounts a grim 10-day ordeal. The chosen girl was dressed in fine garments, plied with potent drinks, and urged to sing, though her songs, he noted, were mournful. She was led from tent to tent, where the dead leader's senior retainers performed ritual intercourse with her. After each act, they instructed her, "Tell your lord I did this out of love for him." On the final day, the chieftain's body lay upon a ship drawn up on shore.